Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all caffeinated, because I only have 20 minutes and it's going to be jam-packed. So I'm a curator here at V2 Lab for the Unstable Media, but I split my week in between this position and a position as a research professor at Avans University. And before I go into my talk titled Aesthetics in the Wild, I would like to briefly stop at what these two roles entail. So you're here in our presentation space of V2, and V2 is a place for art and media technology. Some of you might have the feeling that this is a very recent and emerging sort of crossover domain, but it's actually not. It has a huge history, and some theoreticians trace it back to some fundamental experiments that were done in the 60s. Some go back to Leonardo da Vinci, but the history of V2 goes back to 1982. When V2 was founded around a squad collective in the city of Den Bosch at first, actually. And this collective decided to completely dedicate itself to artistic exploration of technology. And as you can see in this picture, they made one other quite fundamental choice in their program, which is to not focus on the end result of these creative explorations, so just show the work in a museum or gallery setting, but to actually make the experimentation itself public. So what you see a lot in these early days is people gathering around a creative experiment with or through or reflecting on technology. And even though those questions and those technologies have changed over the last 35 years, that spirit is still very much here. So what you still find every week here at V2 are moments like these, where some of the new productions that we're instigating or collaborating on with artists here at V2, we're not trying to sort of display the end result of, but we're trying to make our audience part of this experimentation and really take them along in this creative process. So there's a few upcoming dates presented above the bar over there. So if you're interested in taking part in this type of setting, note down those dates, and we'll see you back here at V2. Now, the other half of my week, I'm a research professor at Avans University of Applied Sciences. And I have a chair there, a chair on human-centered creation, whatever that may mean. But this is part of the Center of Applied Research for Art and Design and Technology. And when you take up such a position, you're sort of invited to give your view on the field that you're working in. And my field, of course, is art and technology. And I published that in a small booklet that you can all download for free at academia, at my academia page. But I'll give you sort of the gist of the argument in that book here today. And I've started to call this argument Aesthetics in the Wild. And I hope that after this, the next 15 minutes or so, you're also inspired to go back into your practices and back into your day, feeling inspired to go into the wild. Well, to first sort of resolve a potential ambiguity there, I'm not talking about this kind of in the wild. I'm not talking about presenting art in very wild context or anything. I actually took inspiration from this book by Edwin Hutchins, that some of you might be familiar with, called Cognition in the Wild. And this has been quite a significant publication in the domain of the cognitive sciences, which I used to work in before I started curating. Basically, what Hutchins in this booklet states is that he argues that what cognitive scientists have been doing up till this publication, at least, has been fundamentally flawed. What cognitive scientists actually want to know about are cognitive phenomena as they happen in our world, right? We're trying to understand, for instance, how it is that we're able to recollect what was in our fridge that morning as we stand in the supermarket doing our groceries to complete some type of recipe that we want to make that evening. But what cognitive scientists then often do is they take this subject out of that supermarket context, place him or her in a laboratory environment, so this environment that's completely stripped of context, and then have this person reproduce items on a grocery list, for instance. And by doing so, we're trying to understand how information flows through our brain, etc. And what Hutchins' critique basically comes down to is that in that translation from this context, from the supermarket into the laboratory environment without context, what you're doing there is, first of all, you change the phenomenon that you're actually studying. Reproducing a grocery list is something radically different from standing in the supermarket and trying to recollect these items in your fridge. But also you leave away part of the potential explanation of this phenomenon. When we're in the supermarket trying to remember what was in our fridge, we often walk through the aisles to try and find cues that help us remind what was in our fridge. Or maybe we ask someone, or we have a discussion with our partner on what we actually made the other days, etc. So we're sort of interacting with this context to help us recollect these items. And this might sound like a bleak philosophical argument, but it had radical implications for the field of cognitive sciences, and as I will show later on also, I hope, for the domains of art and design. First of all, it got rid of this idea that you could achieve intelligence through computation, to pure computation. So for a long time in the artificial intelligence community, the idea was that if you just equip a computer with enough computational power, it would eventually become intelligent. Well, this turned out to be highly problematic because computers like Deep Blue that once beat this famous chess player called Kasparov can only do that. They can only compute the best next move on a chessboard. And of course, a chessboard is not very similar to the real world. A chessboard is a sort of limited environment. It's quite easy actually to oversee the possibilities in the future. Eventually, cognitive scientists started embracing models like these much more. Which were actually already introduced way before Hutchins. And my favorite example of these kinds of behavior-based intelligent models are these vehicles by Valentino Breitenberg. There's a book called Vehicles that he published in, 1984? And it's basically just a series of schematics for cards like these. So these are two cards. They have two light sensors on the front and two actuators, so motoric wheels on the back end, which allows Valentino Breitenberg to very perfectly model the behavior of moving towards the light or always avoiding the light, purely on the basis of connecting the actuators to the sensor. So there's not any kind of internal state there. There's no brain there. There's no processing there. And it turns out that these cards actually are much better at producing this intelligent behavior in the real world as Deep Blue-like systems are that have massive computational power. Turns out that this direct coupling to the world is one of the most important things in modeling intelligence. And it's that sort of insight and finally the embrace of those types of models that made these things possible. So autonomous cars have been around for ages already, and the idea was that they should just be equipped with more computational power so that they could deal with the complexity of the real world. Turns out, to deal with that complexity, you don't need more computational power, you actually need direct couplings to your environment. So the real breakthrough that made these guys a reality these days is the fact that they're able to respond dynamically and directly to the environment rather than be better at computing the best next move. But what's more important for my argument today is that it completely changed our idea of what the mind actually is and how it works. The mind is ontologically and functionally intertwined with environmental, social, and cultural factors. Basically, that means if you want to understand anything about what the mind is or how it works, you have to also include these environmental, social, and cultural factors that surround it. Without that, you cannot possibly explain what cognition is or how it works or what the mind is. So people have been started to call this situated cognition. In other words, cognition is situated. It's in a world. Without that world, it doesn't exist. And I've been doing some looking around in some of my research to other fields in which humans are central to the research. And I found that this is not just the case for cognition. Actually, I nowadays do the bold claim that humans are situated beings. If you want to understand anything about what humans do, why they do it, what they are, you have to see them in context. You have to include the context in which they are, in which they do, etc. And I once left the sciences because I felt that scientific approaches to these questions surrounding humans were very limited. They dealt with a world that was rational, that was logical, etc. Well, I found that the world outside of our laboratory environment was much more unstable, irrational, emotional, and our models didn't apply to that world, it felt. So I started collaborating with artists and designers on the same questions I was researching as a cognitive scientist researcher and found much more interesting approaches. But once I translated this into a career as a curator, I suddenly found myself back in spaces like these. A studio practice, so talking to an artist about new projects in spaces like these, talking about topics that existed far beyond the walls of these studio spaces. And it became even worse when I started doing my first gallery shows. I found myself presenting work of artists in places like these, so white cube spaces, completely devoid of context. And it started dawning on me that maybe I was making the same mistake that Hutchins had been critiquing the cognitive sciences of. Are we, when we make that translation of aesthetics that live in the world that we're confronted with in our daily lives into these spaces, are we not making the same mistake? Are we not leaving out part of the explanation of what aesthetics are and what they do and why they're there? So this sort of made me gravitate towards artists and designers that took radically different approaches, that went into the wild, as Hutchins would call it. And one of my first stops there was a collaboration with a Rotterdam-based artist called Melle Smets that some of you might have heard of. And I'm going to take you through two examples of what this aesthetics in the wild may be. And Melle Smets, I think, is the best one I could come across. Melle Smets, as an artist, had an interest in informal economies. And this might be a phenomenon that you've heard of, right? There's a formal economy where we pay money, and then there's an informal economy where we trade and exchange, etc. And good places to study informal economies are global scrapyards. So these are scrapyards in the world that are highly specific in the type of waste that they deal with. And the interesting thing about these scrapyards is that they become so specific because at some point this type of waste is dumped there, but people around this waste start coming up with ways in which they can create value from this waste. By doing so, they also create a sort of attraction of more of this type of waste. So they create a demand for this waste. More waste starts flowing to that side, and before you know it, you have a very specific type of waste gathered in monstrous proportions. And that also happened in Swami magazine, where now over 200,000 mechanics actually live or try to make a living from automotive scrap from all around the world, arriving there in Swami magazine. Now, economists have been interested in informal economies, and also particularly this one as a prototypical example of a global scrapyard for decades already. But what economists do, of course, is limited to scientific method. They have to score things, they have to make observations and then precisely work out this detail and do their processing of it. As an artist, you can do radically different things to understand this phenomenon. And Melle Smets used his sort of freedom as an autonomous artist to go in there and do something radically different. What he did is what the literature refers to as taking an embedded position. So rather than looking at this context to observe what's going on there, he dived into this context and became an actor in it. So he started reeling and dealing with these mechanics. He rented a little garage, traded pieces and parts, etc. And he traded and he reeled and dealed his way towards this. A car, which might not feel surprising given that there's so many parts there and so much expertise there, but it actually was the first car that was ever produced there, which also is a thing in itself. But why I'm showing you this example is, for one, because Melle Smets decided to take an embedded position in this context, which I think is something that comes with going into the wild to understand something. But also, I'm showing you this show again, which is quite reminiscent of a white cube show. But what we did here is to use that show not as a sort of end result, but to use this context to give this project a new twist. What you see here, this car is just a sort of centerpiece in this exhibition, but what you see around it is all the information that sort of came up as Melle Smets did his actions in this context. So it gives you information about what these guys actually collect, how they rework it, what kind of expertise are there. And Melle Smets eventually also mapped out the whole economy in drawings. And we use that information to host a meeting in this space between the Dutch automotive industry and the economical development platform of Swami magazine to see how these could actually benefit from each other. So this was basically just a kickoff of a new part of the project. And I think that's also important when you go into the wild, that some of these projects, some of the things that you instigate there have no ending. They just continue and evolve, etc. And sometimes there's no clear ending. And I think Melismets is still involved in this project at present. Another completely different example, but closely related, is a work I've been involved with as a curator by Cohen van Baalen. So that's a design duo, Revital Cohen and Tuur van Baalen, which you should look up if you've never heard of them. They make fantastic work. And Cohen van Baalen were interested in the responsibility that consumers of consumer technology have over the strenuous and sometimes also dangerous movements that factory workers make in the factories that producers of our consumer electronics make in these factories. And basically, I think all of us are sort of struggling with this question. As a buyer of an Apple iPhone, am I responsible for what happens in these factories? So I think this was a really interesting question to ask. And they started by tracking down the sort of chain of production between a consumer demand, or the consumer and his or her demands, and the production of these products in the factory. And who they found halfway was someone very familiar to them, because both Cohen and Van Baalen are trained as designers, and they found that actually in the middle between these consumer demands and the production, so the labor involved in producing these consumer goods, was a designer that actually translates these consumer demands into a certain design that then informs these movements in the factory space. So there's a sort of delegated ethical responsibility in this chain, and Cohen van Baalen decided to reflect on this, not just by giving you a schematic of this, but by radically reversing this power relation. And he did so by working with a choreographer on a choreography for these factory workers of beautiful and healthy movements that they could be making in this factory as well. And then have this choreography inform the design of a product. And then together with the people here at V2, we actually brought this product to their consumers. And I'm sure you're all wondering what this product could possibly look like. Well, it ended up looking like this. So there's no function to this technological artifact except for being informed by the movement from this choreography. It looks like a futuristic ghetto blast, I always call it. And then, of course, we were faced with the problem of who's possibly going to buy this? And the answer was eventually turned out quite straightforward, because, of course, the consumers in this case are the visitors of these exhibitions. And also there's been quite a few design collectors that have now bought these artifacts and took them up in their design collections, completing this reversal between the Chinese factory and the consumer here in Europe. Now, why I'm showing you this example in the context of an argument for aesthetics in the wild is that Cohen van Baalen, in this process that I had with them, were very stubborn in that this intervention had to happen in a Chinese factory. It was obvious to us that they could do it for a fraction of the money in their studio in London, just sort of mock up this factory space and get some Asian kids from their circle of friends to act as. But they were insistent on that this had to happen with real factory workers in a factory space where these products are normally consumed. And the reason for that is because there's a huge difference between representing this idea, a design fiction, and actually doing it, an intervention in the wild. And that difference is basically key to my argument for aesthetics in the wild. If you want to reflect on these issues, why not reflect on them directly in the world, in the wild? And I've gone through a lot of these cases of artists and designers that I've found prototypical of working in the wild. And in my more academic research, I'm now trying to sort of pinpoint what it is that they do there and why it's so important. And I'm far from done in this research, but there's a few sort of topics that our research started to revolve around. One is that in the wild, you always have users and audiences that start making active contributions to your aesthetics. And that's interesting because it also means that as a creator, as a creative person, you have to open up to this contribution, while at the same time also steering it in the right direction. So managing it in the way that it still turns into a product or a result that you're satisfied with. You also have to understand your users and audiences much more. So we're now doing a lot of experimentation in my research group at Avans, but also in my curatorial practice here at V2, where we're sort of trying to pinpoint what it is that we're doing with these users and audiences, how to balance this authorship with these contributions. Another sort of cluster in my research group in Breda is focusing on the methodologies of going into the wild. Obviously, if you're as Melle Smets and you're going into a place like Swami Magazine, it's no use bringing your pencils and your canvases, etc. No, it requires completely different methods. And I already told you that there's some literature already saying that this trying to define what it means to take embedded positions, and another key term that always comes up in this is are situated actions, so actions that you do in a context just to bring to light information that otherwise remains implicit. And these methodologies we're trying to sort of capture in literature, but also a study in the process of doing artistic exploration. I hope that this research then eventually contributes to our understanding of our own situatedness in the world. We know that we're related to the people that make our consumer electronics, but do we really understand what this relationship is and how, in terms of its ethics, it actually exists, or what our ethical responsibility over these strenuous movements of these factory workers, for instance, is? I think projects like Cohen van Baarle are shining a light on this and helping us to understand these, not by mocking them up and giving information about this, but by really intervening in the world. Similar to Melle Smets, how do we relate to these people often living in poverty on such a global scrapyard? What is our responsibility there? How does this relate to the industry that we have here? And I think there's many more sort of big challenges ahead of us, where we also really need to have artists and designers to help us understand how we relate to these issues. For instance, such an abstract problem as climate change, right? Do we really understand how what our individual relationship is to such big abstract problems? I don't think so. And I think artists and designers have an important role to play in helping us understand and making experiential what that relationship is. And one other theme or topic I would like to address going into the wild, especially here in the context of V2, is this sort of idea that is imposed on us. The idea that our city and our lives will become much better once it's all automatized, once our cities are completely revolving around data and our data. I think the problem here is, well, for one, in this interaction with our urban environment, we're losing, of course, a lot of control over this relationship to our surroundings. But I think there's a much more deeper fundamental issue here, and that is, if we're really situated beings, it means that we can only understand ourselves by probing this relationship to our surroundings. And if this is taken away from us by technology and the third parties behind this, how are we to still understand ourselves? So there, I think there's a big fundamental challenge ahead of us that I think artists and designers can contribute to if we're willing to go into the wild. So I hope this sort of brief summary of the argument will make you go out there again into your day and consider doing things slightly more wild today. Thank you very much.